Beyond the Edge, historic expeditions and their impact. On a frost-bitten morning in 1915, Ernest Shackleton stood on the deck of his slowly dying ship and made a decision that would echo through history. The Antarctic ice was crushing his vessel like a python constricting its prey, and he had to choose between his ego and his men's lives. In that moment, like so many explorers before and after him, he faced the ultimate question: how far is too far? History's greatest expeditions have never been mere journeys from point A to point B. They are stories of human audacity colliding with nature's indifference, of ambition dancing with mortality. They are tales of men and women who looked at maps marked "Here be dragons" and thought, "Let's find out." This is not a book about success. Or rather, not just about success. It's about the price of pushing boundaries, about the thin line between courage and madness that every great explorer has walked. From the frozen wasteland of Antarctica to the scorching decks of Renaissance galleons, from the towering waves of the Northwest Passage to the dizzying peaks of Tibet, these 5 expeditions redrew the maps of both our world and our human potential. Some of our protagonists returned as heroes. Others never returned at all. Isabella Bird defied every Victorian convention to become the first female fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. Roald Amundsen disappeared into the Arctic for years to prove a passage was possible. Ferdinand Magellan's hubris led him to a distant shore where he met his end, even as his expedition completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. Admiral Zheng He commanded ships that dwarfed Columbus's fleet, venturing forth from Ming Dynasty China in a display of power that would not be equaled for centuries. But perhaps most remarkably, these explorers were not superhuman. They were people who simply refused to accept the boundaries of their time. They were driven by forces we all recognize: curiosity, ambition, defiance, and sometimes simple desperation. Their stories remind us that every great achievement in human history began with someone willing to step off the edge of the known world. These are their stories. Not just the triumphs that made it into history books, but the frozen nights, the mutinous crews, the moments of doubt, and the impossible decisions. This is exploration in all its brutal, beautiful truth. Welcome aboard Shackleton's Endurance, a tale of survival and leadership. The Norwegian carpenter bent down to examine the ship's hull, his breath crystallizing in the polar air. "She's crying, sir," he told Shackleton, pointing to the wooden beams that groaned under tons of ice pressure. The carpenter didn't need to explain further. Ships, like humans, make distinct sounds when they're dying. It was October 1915, and the Endurance had been trapped in pack ice for 10 months. Ernest Shackleton had planned to lead the first crossing of the Antarctic continent, a bold venture that would secure Britain's place in the annals of exploration. Instead, he was about to witness his vessel's slow execution by the most patient killer on Earth, Antarctic ice. The press had called it the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a grandiose name that now seemed like a taunt from fate. Shackleton had recruited his crew with a famous newspaper advertisement: "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." The men who answered that call were about to get significantly more hazard than they'd bargained for. When the Endurance finally surrendered to the ice that autumn, it didn't go quietly. The ship's death throes lasted days, with timbers screaming and decks buckling. "The sound," crew members later wrote, "was like listening to the skeleton of some enormous beast being crushed." Shackleton stood watch until the end, then turned to his men with 5 words that would define the next phase of their journey: "Ship and stores abandoned. God help us." What followed was perhaps the greatest survival story in the history of exploration. 28 men, 3 lifeboats, and a frozen continent between them and civilization. The ice floe they camped on was drifting north, but it was also melting. Each night, men took turns watching for cracks that might split their temporary island and their tent in two. After 5 months of drifting, they spotted something that looked like water on the horizon. It was their first glimpse of the open sea in 522 days. But salvation came with a price tag. They would have to navigate some of the world's most treacherous waters in 3 small lifeboats. Shackleton chose 5 men for what would become the most daring small boat journey ever attempted. Their target was South Georgia Island, a speck of rock 800 miles away across the Southern Ocean. The odds were so bad that Shackleton didn't even write contingency plans for failure. In the boat they called the James Caird, 6 men faced waves as tall as church steeples and winds that could strip canvas from masts. They navigated by sextant, though their hands shook so badly from cold that readings were nearly impossible. When they finally reached South Georgia, they discovered they'd landed on the wrong side. The whaling stations, their only hope for rescue, lay across 29 miles of uncharted mountains and glaciers that no human had ever crossed. Shackleton and 2 others made that crossing without maps, proper equipment, or rest. They walked, climbed, and slid for 36 hours straight, propelled by the knowledge that every minute they delayed decreased the survival chances of the men they'd left behind. The final twist in this tale of endurance came during the rescue. It took Shackleton 4 attempts to reach his stranded crew, fighting through ice that seemed determined to keep its prisoners. When he finally reached them, he found every single man alive. Years later, one of the crew members wrote, "For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when there seems to be no way out, get on your knees and pray for Shackleton." But perhaps the most telling detail came from Shackleton himself. When asked about the moment he was most proud of, he didn't mention the boat journey or the mountain crossing. Instead, he recalled a night during their march across the ice when he noticed one of his men was missing a mitten. Without fanfare, Shackleton gave the man his own spare pair. "A leader," he later wrote, "is the one who would sacrifice his best gloves." The endurance expedition failed in its stated mission. They never even reached the Antarctic continent. But in failing, Shackleton and his crew achieved something far more remarkable. They showed us what humans can endure when failure is not an option. Roald Amundsen's quest for the Northwest Passage. When Roald Amundsen stood before the Royal Geographical Society in 1903, they saw a polite Norwegian gentleman in a well-cut suit. What they couldn't see was the deception brewing behind his pleasant smile. The expedition he proposed, a scientific study of the magnetic North Pole, was a carefully constructed facade. His true ambition was far more audacious, to conquer the unclaimed prize that had swallowed over 200 ships and 1,500 lives across 4 centuries, the Northwest Passage. He had borrowed every penny he could, mortgaged his future, and purchased a shallow-drafted herring boat called Gjoa. At 70 feet long and equipped with a small motor, she was considered absurdly small for Arctic exploration. The British Admiralty had been using ships 4 times her size and losing them. But Amundsen understood something his predecessors hadn't. In the Arctic, bigger wasn't better. It was fatal. The Gjoa slipped out of Oslo harbor on a summer evening, carrying a crew of just 6 men. None of them knew their captain had lied to their financial backers, or that they were embarking on what might be a multi-year journey. Amundsen's brother had warned him that no one would fund a Northwest Passage attempt by an unproven explorer. "Then they won't know until it's too late to stop us," Amundsen had replied. Their first winter trapped in ice taught them how laughably unprepared they were. European wool froze solid. Their boots cracked in the cold. Traditional navigation methods proved useless in a world where compass needles pointed sideways and the sun disappeared for months. But while other expeditions had treated the Arctic's indigenous peoples as curiosities or servants, Amundsen went to school. He lived with the Netsilik Inuit, learning to build igloos that were warmer than his ship's cabin. He adopted their loose-fitting caribou fur clothing, discovering it was superior to anything European tailors had devised. His crew thought he'd gone native. The Netsilik thought he was oddly obsessed with their most basic survival skills. Both were right. Spring brought new terrors. The ice that had trapped them all winter now threatened to crush them, or worse, free them into waters so shallow their charts showed only blank spaces. Amundsen took to walking ahead of the ship with a pole, gambling his life on ice thickness while measuring water depth. One wrong step meant death by hypothermia. One wrong navigation decision meant losing their ship. In King William Land, they found evidence of the price others had paid for this passage. Fragments of Franklin's lost expedition. The bones of 129 men who had died trying to walk south after their ships were crushed. They had carried silver cutlery and ceramic plates, but lacked the basic knowledge to feed themselves in the Arctic. Amundsen wrote in his journal that night, "The Northwest Passage has claimed enough lives. We will learn or we will join them." On August 26, 1905, the Gjoa rounded Point Barrow, Alaska. They had done it, the first complete transit of the Northwest Passage. But their triumph came with a twist. They were trapped by ice 500 yards from open water. Another winter in the Arctic loomed. Amundsen, knowing his crew's limits, made an extraordinary decision. He skied 500 miles to Eagle City, Alaska to telegraph their success to the world. He then skied back to rejoin his men for their final winter. When they finally sailed into Nome in 1906, they found themselves heroes of a new age. But Amundsen was changed. The Arctic had taught him that survival wasn't about strength or resources, it was about adaptation. Victory, he wrote, awaits him who has everything in order. Luck, people call it. This lesson would serve him well. A decade later, he would use this same philosophy, small teams, careful preparation, and cultural adaptation, to beat Robert Scott to the South Pole. But it was here, in the labyrinthine ice channels of the Northwest Passage, that Amundsen developed his revolutionary approach to polar exploration. The Gjoa herself now rests in a museum in Oslo, her humble size still startling visitors who expect something more magnificent. But her real legacy lives on in modern polar exploration. The recognition that in the world's harshest environments, success belongs not to the strongest or the best equipped, but to those willing to unlearn everything they think they know. The legacy of Zheng He's treasure fleet. In 1405, the largest wooden ships ever built sliced through the waves of the South China Sea. Their red sails, each bearing the imperial dragon of the Ming Dynasty, stretched 9 stories high. Leading this armada was a man who had begun life as a war prisoner and risen to become China's greatest admiral, a 7-foot-tall Muslim eunuch named Zheng He. His flagship dwarfed anything Europe would build for the next 5 centuries. While Columbus's Santa Maria was barely longer than a modern tennis court, Zheng He's treasure ships stretched longer than a football field. Each carried a crew of 1,000, with gardens growing fresh vegetables on deck and elaborate systems of wells for fresh water. These weren't mere ships, they were floating cities. The numbers stagger the imagination. 317 vessels, 28,000 men, stretching across the horizon like a moving forest of masts. Navigators charted their course using arrays of magnetized needles floating in bowls of water, calibrated to the stars. The fleet carried diplomatic gifts that included golden brocades, delicate porcelain, and live giraffes. In an age when most sailors never ventured beyond sight of land, Zheng He's navigators plotted courses across thousands of miles of open ocean. But perhaps most remarkable was the admiral himself. Taken from his home in Yunnan as a child during a Ming military campaign, he had been made a eunuch and served in the imperial palace. Where others might have been broken, he turned displacement into opportunity. He mastered multiple languages, studied Islamic astronomy and mathematics, and caught the attention of Prince Zhu Di, the man who would become the Yongle Emperor. When Zhu Di seized the Dragon Throne in a bloody civil war, he remembered the brilliant eunuch who had helped him plot military strategy, Zheng. He was given command of the greatest fleet ever assembled, with orders that revealed the Emperor's breathtaking ambition. Go to the Western Oceans. Show them the might of Ming. The treasure fleet visited ports from Vietnam to East Africa, creating a network of trade and tribute that reshaped Asia. When they encountered pirates off the coast of Sumatra, Zheng He didn't flee. He captured the pirate king and brought him to Nanjing for execution. When the king of Ceylon challenged their presence, the fleet's response was swift and decisive. The king found himself captured and transported to China, where he learned the wisdom of respecting Ming authority. But this wasn't just gunboat diplomacy. Zheng He's fleet carried doctors who treated local rulers, astronomers who shared scientific knowledge, and diplomats skilled in the delicate art of presenting foreign kings with gifts valuable enough to impress, but not so valuable as to suggest equality with the Ming emperor. Every port visit was a carefully choreographed display of Ming superiority and benevolence. The fleet's arrival at any port was a scene of calculated theater. First came the smallest support vessels, then the medium-sized supply ships, and finally the treasure ships themselves, each revealing the last to be larger than observers had thought possible. Local rulers found themselves meeting Chinese diplomats in the shadow of ships that made their own naval forces look like children's toys. Yet for all its grandeur, the treasure fleet era ended abruptly. Court politics turned against the expensive voyages. The Confucian scholars, who had always opposed maritime adventure, gained the emperor's ear. They argued that China had everything worth having. What could be gained by sailing to barbaric lands? The great ships were left to rot in their berths. Records of their construction were destroyed. Within a century, building a ship with more than 2 masts became a capital crime in China. When Portuguese explorers reached China in 1513, they found a nation that had deliberately forgotten its maritime greatness. The Chinese officials they met refused to believe Europeans had crossed the ocean to reach them. Such journeys, they claimed, were impossible. But Zheng He's legacy survived in unexpected ways. In the ports he visited, stories persisted of the great ships from the east. Ancient maps carried warnings about Chinese sovereignty. Porcelain from his fleet's visits turned up in African archaeological sites. Most tellingly, when later European explorers reached the Indian Ocean, they found harbor masters still carrying sailing directions written in Chinese. The treasure fleet represents one of history's great might-have-beens. A century before Europe's age of exploration began, China had the technology, resources, and organizational capacity to create a global maritime empire. Instead, they chose isolation. Zheng He's voyages stand as testament to both human potential and the fragile nature of progress, a reminder that the course of history often turns not on what is possible, but on what is permitted. Isabella Bird, defying Victorian boundaries. In 1892, a diminutive woman in her 60s stood before the Royal Geographical Society in London. The audience of distinguished gentlemen shifted uncomfortably. No woman had ever addressed their assembly before. But Isabella Bird had long since stopped caring what Victorian society thought proper. She had ridden through bandit-infested lands in Korea, faced down tigers in India, and scaled active volcanoes in Hawaii. London's disapproval hardly registered anymore. The story she told that night began in a sick room in Edinburgh, where doctors had once predicted she would live out her days as an invalid. Chronic insomnia and spinal problems had confined her to bed through her 20s. Then a physician made an unusual prescription: sea air. Her father scraped together £100 for passage to North America. The moment Isabella felt the spray of the Atlantic, something awakened in her that would never sleep again. Her spine straightened. Her headaches vanished. She discovered that the further she got from Victorian drawing rooms, the better she felt. It was as if her body had been waiting all along for adventure. In Colorado's Estes Park, she found herself racing through snowstorms on her mare, nicknamed Mountain Boy. Local outlaws, who initially mocked the proper English lady, soon learned she could outride them all. Jim Nugent, a notorious one-eyed desperado, declared her the first woman who wasn't afraid of anything. When she confessed in letters home that she had ridden astride rather than side saddle, her sister burned the letters to protect the family reputation. But it was in Japan that Isabella truly shed her Victorian skin. She ventured into regions where no Westerner had been seen before, traveling alone through remote villages in the 1870s. Her small stature and gender, initially seen as disadvantages, became assets. Where male explorers faced hostility, she was often welcomed into homes and shown ancient traditions. She documented everything in photographs and precise notes, developing a journalist's eye for detail and an anthropologist's appreciation for cultural context. In Malaysia, she learned to navigate rivers by dugout canoe while documenting previously unknown tribal customs. When warned that tigers stalked the jungle paths, she simply adjusted her travel schedule to noon, noting that tigers preferred to hunt at dawn and dusk. Her matter-of-fact approach to danger unsettled her contemporaries more than the dangers themselves. Tibet tested her limits. At 60, she crossed passes higher than Mont Blanc, battling altitude sickness and temperatures that froze her ink solid. When her guides refused to continue, citing demons that supposedly haunted certain valleys, she pressed on alone. She later discovered she had mapped regions no cartographer had ever recorded. In Persia, she joined a Kurdish caravan despite warnings about bandits. When they were indeed attacked, she calmly photographed the skirmish. The Kurdish chiefs were so impressed by her sang-froid that they adopted her as an honorary member of their tribe. She used this status to gain access to harems and religious sites no Western man had ever seen. What truly set Isabella apart wasn't just her courage, but her eye for scientific detail. Her books weren't mere travelogues. They contained detailed observations of flora, fauna, and geological formations that would later prove invaluable to scientists. She documented medical practices, architectural styles, and social customs with a precision that transformed her adventures into anthropological gold mines. The Royal Geographic Society had no choice but to reconsider their male-only membership policy. In 1892, Isabella Bird Bishop became their first female fellow. The announcement was made in the same room where, years earlier, she had been refused entry to lectures because of her gender. Her last major expedition, at age 65, took her through the Yangtze Valley. Local officials, hearing of her approach, assumed the English scholar bird must be a man. They were startled to find a small, elderly woman who insisted on traveling to regions deemed too dangerous for armed military escorts. She returned with the first detailed documentation of several minority peoples and previously unmapped mountain ranges. When she finally died in Edinburgh at 73, they found her bags packed for another journey. Her will directed that her substantial fortune be used to fund medical missions in the remote areas she had explored. Even in death, she was pushing boundaries. Isabella Bird's greatest expedition was through the constraints of her era. She didn't just explore the world, she redrew the maps of what was possible for women of her time. In doing so, she left behind something more valuable than any geographical discovery, proof that the only real invalids are those who accept the limitations others place upon them. Magellan's fatal circumnavigation, a journey of discovery and despair. In the autumn of 1520, 3 ships approached a forbidding channel at the bottom of the world. Behind them lay a trail of mutiny, execution, and despair. Ahead lay waters no European had ever sailed. Ferdinand Magellan stood at the helm of the Trinidad, watching towering cliffs squeeze the passage ever narrower. Dark clouds churned overhead, and in the distance, strange fires flickered along the shoreline, the flames that would give this land its name, Tierra del Fuego. "Turn back," his officers pleaded. They had already lost 2 ships, one to treachery, another to the merciless Patagonian coast. The men were eating rats and boiling leather straps for soup. But Magellan had burned his metaphorical ships long before leaving Spain. "I will go on," he declared, "even if we must eat the leather off the ship's yards." This was not mere stubbornness. Magellan harbored a secret that drove him relentlessly forward. Portuguese maps he had studied suggested a passage to the Spice Islands that would break his former homeland's monopoly on the spice trade. But these maps had cost him dearly. Portugal's king, furious at Magellan's defection to Spain, had put a price on his head. His fleet had departed Seville with 270 men, many of them criminals released from Spanish prisons. Among them were spies planted by the Portuguese crown, professional saboteurs tasked with ensuring the expedition's failure. Just 3 days out, Magellan caught his captain of the fleet signaling to trigger a mutiny. It was only the first of many betrayals. Off the coast of South America, 3 ships' captains rose against him. Magellan's response was swift and brutal. One captain was beheaded, another marooned on a desolate shore. The third was drawn and quartered, his limbs displayed on spikes as a warning. The men learned that their commander's mercy, like their provisions, had strict limits. The passage that now bears his name nearly broke them. For 38 days they battled through the strait, fighting winds that threatened to dash them against razor-sharp cliffs. When the San Antonio deserted in the night, taking with it much of their remaining food, Magellan didn't hesitate. They pushed on. When they finally broke through into the ocean on the other side, Magellan wept. He named it the Pacific, peaceful, in a moment of relief that would prove tragically premature. What followed was the most terrible ocean crossing in history. For 3 months and 20 days, they saw no land. The water they carried rotted in its barrels. Men died of scurvy, their gums bleeding, their bodies covered in suppurating sores. They ate sawdust and rats and the leather off the rigging. Of all their torments, Magellan's chronicler wrote, "The worst was that our mouths had turned to leather from binding the ropes." Yet Magellan drove them on. He alone seemed immune to hunger and doubt. When they finally reached Guam, the starving crew watched in horror as he hanged a sailor for stealing food. Order, he believed, was all that stood between them and oblivion. The bitter irony of Magellan's fate was that he died just short of completing his mission. In the Philippines, he became embroiled in local politics, believing he could extend Spanish dominion through force of arms. On a small island called Mactan, he waded ashore in full armor to subdue a rebellious chief. The shallow water trapped him as native warriors surrounded his position. His men, watching from the ship, saw him fighting until he was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The great navigator died in water too shallow to swim in, too far from home to retreat. Only one ship, the Victoria, would complete the circumnavigation under Juan Sebastian Elcano. Of the 270 men who departed Seville, only 18 would return. They arrived with their hull nearly empty of cargo, but laden with knowledge that would transform the world. The Pacific was not a narrow channel, but the largest ocean on Earth. The world was far vaster than anyone had imagined. And it was definitively round. Magellan never saw his mission completed, never received the acclaim that would later attach to his name. The magnitude of his achievement, finding the strait, crossing the Pacific, accurately gauging the true size of the Earth, was overshadowed by the horrific human cost. Yet his voyage marked a turning point in human history, the moment when the theoretical became actual, when the globe became truly global. In Seville's Archive of the Indies, there's a faded document listing supplies for Magellan's fleet. Among the provisions are steel mirrors intended as gifts for indigenous peoples. These mirrors, never delivered, serve as a fitting metaphor for his expedition, an attempt to show humanity its true face, its actual dimensions. The reflection proved more terrible and more magnificent than anyone had imagined. The new era of exploration. On a clear night in the Atacama Desert, astronomers gather around the world's largest telescope, peering into darkness so profound it reveals light from the edge of time. In the depths of the Pacific, autonomous vehicles probe hydrothermal vents where life exists in forms we're still struggling to comprehend. And in laboratories across the globe, explorers of a different kind map the hidden landscapes of human DNA, venturing into territories far stranger than any Magellan encountered. The age of blank spaces on maps has ended. Every mountain peak has been scaled, every ocean trench sounded. Yet paradoxically, we live in the greatest era of exploration humanity has ever known. Consider the team that first photographed a black hole in 2019. Like Zheng He's treasure fleet, they coordinated observatories across multiple continents. Like Amundsen in the Arctic, they had to adapt their instruments to conditions that defied conventional wisdom. Like Shackleton's men, They faced the seemingly impossible and refused to accept failure. The resulting image, a ring of light around absolute darkness, marked a boundary as significant as any strait or passage. Deep beneath the Mediterranean Sea, physicists hunt for cosmic neutrinos using detectors strung through miles of darkened water. These modern explorers faced challenges that would have seemed familiar to Isabella Bird: skeptical institutions, technical obstacles, and the ever-present risk of failure. Yet they persist, driven by the same hunger that pushed her into unmapped territories. The most profound expeditions now take place at scales Magellan could never have imagined. Microbiologists venture into the human microbiome, discovering entire ecosystems within our own bodies. Quantum physicists probe realities so strange that our languages strain to describe them. These explorers don't plant flags or claim territories. They expand the boundaries of human understanding itself. Yet something vital connects these modern ventures to their historical predecessors. When the Mars rover Perseverance landed in Jezero crater, its first images revealed a landscape as alien as any Zheng He encountered. The engineering team that guided it there faced the same essential challenge as Magellan: how to venture into the unknown with limited resources and no possibility of rescue. The tools have changed. Satellite navigation has replaced sextants, computer models stand in for hand-drawn charts. But the fundamental qualities of exploration remain constant: courage, innovation, and the willingness to risk everything in pursuit of discovery. Perhaps most remarkably, modern exploration has become democratized. Citizen scientists track migrating animals via satellite. Amateur astronomers discover comets from their backyards. Genetic databases grow through contributions from thousands of individuals. The lone explorer hasn't vanished, but they've been joined by networks of discovery that span the globe. What would our 5 explorers make of this new age? Shackleton might recognize himself in the engineers planning Mars missions, calculating precisely how to keep humans alive in lethal environments. Amundsen would appreciate the meticulous preparation behind deep-sea expeditions. Bird would surely delight in the women leading quantum physics labs and space programs. Zheng He might see echoes of his diplomatic missions in international scientific collaborations. And Magellan, he would understand the cost of pushing boundaries, the price we still pay for reaching into the unknown. As we stand on the brink of new frontiers, artificial intelligence, interplanetary travel, the quantum realm, it's worth remembering that exploration has never been about reaching a destination. It's about expanding the sphere of human possibility. Every time we venture beyond known limits, we redraw the maps of what our species can achieve. The greatest discoveries of our age may not come from crossing oceans or scaling peaks. They may emerge from data analysis, laboratory breakthroughs, or algorithmic insights. But they will require the same essential qualities that drove our 5 explorers: the courage to venture beyond conventional wisdom, the resilience to face repeated failure, and the vision to see past current limitations. The blank spaces on our maps have moved from Earth's surface to the cosmos above and the quantum realm below. But the call that draws us forward remains the same, that ancient, irresistible whisper that says, "What lies beyond?"